When people talk about the American car market, they usually start with the wrong question. They ask whether the average new vehicle has become too expensive. They ask whether interest rates are too high. They ask whether delinquencies have risen too far. They ask whether dealers got greedy, whether manufacturers lost discipline, whether gas prices will break the consumer, whether tariffs will add another layer of pain. All of those questions matter. None of them gets to the center of it. The center of it is much simpler and much uglier. America took a useful machine, turned it into a social credential, wrapped it in credit, made it essential for getting to work, then taught millions of people to confuse the monthly payment with a normal cost of adulthood. That is how you create a market that can look healthy right up until the moment it begins to crack. I have spent my life watching what happens when a society mistakes leverage for prosperity. The pattern is always familiar. At first, the debt appears to solve a practical problem, then it becomes a convenience, then it becomes a habit, then it becomes an expectation. And finally, it becomes a form of quiet coercion where people borrow not because the purchase is wise, but because the alternative is social embarrassment, professional difficulty, or simple exclusion from ordinary economic life. By the time you reach that stage, you are no longer dealing with a healthy market. You are dealing with dependence. That is what I see in the car business. The average new car price has moved above $50,000. The typical payment sits just under $800. A month delinquencies have climbed to levels not seen since the years after the financial crisis. Repossessions are rising. Negative equity is being rolled from one loan into the next one. 7-year loans are no longer strange. 84-month loans are no longer rare. And a meaningful share of borrowers are carrying payments of $1,000 or more for an asset that falls in value almost from the moment it leaves the lot. If a man asked me how to design a system that looked modern and impressive while quietly eating the future income of the middle class, I would tell him to study this one. The tragedy is that it did not have to be built this way. If you go back to Henry Ford, you find something the country has spent a century forgetting. Ford understood that an industrial economy could not remain healthy if the people doing the work had neither the time nor the money to participate in the prosperity their labor created. In 1914, he moved to the standardized 8-hour day and paid $5 a day, more than double the industry standard. Adjusted for inflation, that was roughly $163 a day. Even now, a shocking portion of the American workforce still makes less than a Ford factory worker effectively made more than a century ago. That fact alone ought to stop people in their tracks. Ford was not running a charity, he was running a business. But he understood something modern America has gone out of its way to unlearn. A business can thrive when workers are treated as participants in the system rather than disposable inputs to it. He wanted scale, he wanted productivity, he wanted growth, but he also wanted customers who could afford the fruits of industrial progress and workers who had enough life left in the day to enjoy being alive. That is a very different vision from the one that won later. When Ford decided to reinvest profits, build capacity, raise living standards, lower prices, and spread the benefits of the industrial system more broadly, he ran into the hard wall of investor priority. The legal fight that followed, dodge the fee. Ford did more than resolve a dispute inside one company. It helped set the cultural direction for a country. The message was clear: expanding operations, improving worker conditions, and lowering prices might be admirable. But they were not to outrank the imperative of maximizing returns. A line was drawn. On one side stood the idea that industry should build lives. On the other stood the idea that industry exists first to extract financial output. America has spent most of the years since then proving which side won. When Ford's dominance slipped and Alfred P. Sloan rose at General Motors, the spirit of the industry changed with him. Ford wanted to build cars for a mass public. Sloan wanted to build a ladder of aspiration. Ford distrusted consumer debt. Sloan understood that debt could be turned into an engine of demand. Ford thought in terms of affordability. Sloan thought in terms of segmentation, status, and upgrade cycles. That is one of the great turning points in American economic psychology. The machine stopped being only a machine. It became a badge, a signal, a public ranking device, a way to tell your neighbors, your coworkers, and your own insecure mind what rung of the ladder you occupied. Once that happens, the sale is no longer limited by cash. It is limited only by how much future income lenders are willing to pull into the present. That is where the modern auto loan was waiting. What people politely call planned obsolescence is really a social tax on insecurity. A small design change here, a model refresh there, a little technological tweak, a little more styling, a little more pressure to believe that what you already own has become a statement about who you are. The result is not just that people replace vehicles sooner than they need to. The deeper result is that they internalize the upgrade cycle as a form of personal maintenance. They do not merely ask whether the current car still runs. They ask whether the current car still says the right thing. That is an expensive question. It becomes ruinous when the answer is financed. Today, Americans owe about $1.6 trillion in auto loan debt. That makes it the second largest category of consumer debt after mortgages. Nearly 1/5 of borrowers now carry monthly car payments of at least $1,000. More than 1 in 5 new car buyers are taking loans that run for 84 months or longer. More than a quarter of trade-ins carry negative equity of $10,000 or more. Roughly a third of drivers are underwater on their vehicles. None of that is an accident. It is what you get when the industry is no longer centered on selling transportation at a sensible price, but on selling access to transportation through the expansion of credit. The United States made that transition easier by building modern life around the car itself. Highways expanded cities beyond their cores. Suburbs spread, distances widened. Public transportation in many places withered or was cut back. For millions of people, a car ceased to be a convenience and became the admission ticket to ordinary employment. You need it to get to work. You need it to take the children where they need to go. You need it to keep your schedule intact. You need it when the bus route is gone, when the train does not exist. When the neighborhood was designed for parking lots instead of sidewalks, by the time the economy reaches that shape, the car is no longer a discretionary good for a large share of the population. It is a compulsory expense. That changes the morality of the problem. A man buying a toy he cannot afford is one thing. A widow financing a used car because she has to reach a job 30 minutes away in a city with weak transit is something else entirely. The first case involves vanity. The second involves structure. A serious country would know the difference. A serious country would stop lecturing the second person as though she had wandered into foolishness for sport. What makes the current car market so dangerous is that it sits exactly at the intersection of those two populations. It feeds off the people who truly need a vehicle to survive, and it also feeds off the people conditioned to treat the vehicle as an identity project. That is why the system is so sticky. Need and vanity are being financed by the same machinery. The dealership model only intensifies the distortion. In much of America, franchise laws prevent manufacturers from selling directly to customers. That means extra layers, extra fees, extra incentives, and a business model that increasingly depends on financing income rather than the quality of the machine itself. When that happens, the car is only one part of the transaction. The loan becomes the real product. If you want to understand modern American capitalism, you can learn a lot by watching how often the visible product is not the true product. The visible product is a vehicle. The true product is a long stream of payments. The visible product is mobility. The true product is your future cash flow. The visible product is freedom. The true product is obligation. Once the industry begins to think that way, the incentives shift in ways that should worry any honest lender. Subprime credit expands to keep volume moving. Loans get packaged into securities and sold into financial markets. Negative equity is folded into new loans, so the old mistake can be hidden inside a fresh agreement. Longer terms make impossible prices look manageable on a monthly basis. And the borrower is taught to think like a renter of his own income. He does not ask what the total cost will be. He asks whether the payment can somehow be squeezed into the month. That is how people end up financing a depreciating asset for longer than the useful financial life of the asset itself. It is also how prime borrowers begin to crack. Not just subprime borrowers when delinquency rises among households that were once considered relatively secure. You are not looking at a pocket of irresponsibility. You are looking at stress spreading into the supposedly stable part of the structure. That should make anyone with a memory uneasy. I have watched many bubbles from different angles. The most dangerous feature is not enthusiasm at the peak. It is the quiet assumption underneath the structure that refinancing, rolling forward packaging, and optimism will always remain available. That assumption keeps the game alive longer than common sense would permit. Then one day the market discovers that what looked like flexibility was just a delay mechanism. The car business has another habit that tells you precisely what sort of culture sits beneath it. Now it has started charging people over and over again for things they once thought they owned. $5 to unlock your own car from an app. $10 for heated seats. A fee for extra acceleration. A fee to use the speakers more fully. A fee for the space under the hood. This is not an innovation story. It is a rent extraction story. It is the old logic of the monthly payment spreading into the machine itself. The financier's mentality does not stop once the loan is signed. It follows the customer into the cabin, into the dashboard, into the software, into the daily experience of ownership. The same mentality appears in the data business growing around connected cars. Drive here, brake this way, travel late, accelerate hard. Now your behavior becomes another asset to package and monetize. What began as manufacturing turns into surveillance. What was sold as convenience becomes another tool for pricing you, scoring you, and charging you. That is not the future people were promised when industrial productivity was supposed to make life easier. It is a future where the consumer is mined from every direction. At some point, a person has to ask a simple question: how many times can the same household be charged for the same need before the system admits it is predatory? The answer in modern America appears to be many more times than decency would tolerate. There is another reason this market feels so unstable to me. It is tied to too many other fragile systems. Gasoline rises and suddenly commuting costs swell. Insurance rises and the monthly burden jumps again. Repairs rise and a household already stretched to make the payment loses what little breathing room it had. Tariffs hit steel, aluminum, or imported vehicles, and production costs move higher. Conflict threatens an energy choke point and oil takes another run. Upward, the average driver traveling roughly 13,500 miles a year does not need an economist to explain what $1 more per gallon means. He feels it in the budget immediately. For a household already unable to absorb a surprise $500 expense, that is not a rounding error. That is pressure. Pressure on the job commute. Pressure on the grocery bill, pressure on the card balance, pressure on the loan that was already too large. In a sound system, higher fuel prices would hurt. In a brittle system, they expose whatever was already unstable. That is why I do not look at the car market and see an isolated industry problem. I see one more place where the country has built ordinary life on assumptions that do not deserve to be trusted. I see the same kind of optimism that shows up whenever a society tries to turn every necessity into an investable stream of payments. There is one part of the matter that deserves special care. Many people trapped in ugly car loans are blamed as if the entire structure began and ended with their personal weakness. That is lazy thinking. Some people absolutely do chase appearances they cannot afford. That is true. Some people buy status with borrowed money. That is also true. But many other people are simply trying to remain employable, keep children safe, show up on time, or survive in a geography that punishes anyone without reliable transportation. If a person did everything by the book and still wound up with a suffocating auto payment because wages failed to keep pace with prices, transit alternatives disappeared, and the used market got distorted, that is not a moral failure. That is a policy failure, an incentive failure, and a cultural failure. I think it is important to say that plainly, because millions of people are carrying shame for something that was designed above their heads. When a system is set up to funnel people toward debt and then mock them once they are trapped by it, the mockery is not evidence of wisdom. It is evidence of rot. One of the saddest habits in America is the instinct to evaluate a person's balance sheet by the paint job in the parking lot. I have seen people laugh at old cars as if age itself were a mark of failure. I have seen workers mocked for bringing lunch instead of buying it. I have seen ordinary paid-off vehicles treated as social embarrassments by people who were themselves drowning in payments. That inversion tells you almost everything. A culture has gone badly wrong when the man quietly preserving his flexibility is ridiculed by the man renting an image at $800 a month. I learned long ago that many of the people who look rich are merely spending in public. That is not the same thing as being rich. And many of the people who look plain are preserving optionality, which is one of the most valuable forms of wealth there is. If I hand two men the same income and one of them uses it to create appearance while the other uses it to create room to breathe, the second man has a future the first man does not yet understand. The culture around cars has done real damage because it attacks that truth at a very young age. A teenager gets mocked for driving a battered old machine. A young worker gets mocked for not upgrading. A bank employee gets mocked by adults for being too frugal. A person carrying lunch instead of buying it gets treated as if thrift were a character flaw. None of those moments is trivial. Together, they train people to spend against their own interests. The lesson is repeated until it sounds natural. You are what you drive. You are what you wear. You are what you signal. You are what other people can envy. A society that repeats those messages all day should not act surprised when households mortgage their peace of mind to buy social cover. What impressed me in the testimony I read was not just the statistics. It was the contrast between how different people interpreted the same reality. Inside the dealership, managers were confused that consumers were not showing up with enthusiasm. Outside the dealership, grocery prices were up, food kitchens were busier, credit profiles were weaker, and people were only coming in when they absolutely had to replace transportation. That is not a mystery. That is what happens when the selling side keeps staring at unit volume while the living side keeps staring at survival. The two worlds drift apart until the sales floor begins to sound delusional. If eggs are expensive, if rent is high, if medical costs are pressing, if insurance is rising, if wages are stretched, then no amount of optimism in a showroom changes the budget in a kitchen. It is always dangerous when an industry grows more fluent in its own sales language than in the financial condition of its customers. That is usually the last phase before reality reintroduces itself. I do not know the exact month or year when the biggest crack will appear. People who claim to know that are usually flattering themselves, but I do know how fragility behaves. When a market depends on rising prices, long financing terms, aggressive credit extension, stable fuel costs, manageable insurance, healthy employment, and public willingness to keep treating debt as normal, it has many more ways to weaken than to strengthen. Remove the oil problem and there is still a credit problem. Remove the tariff problem and there is still an affordability problem. Remove the dealership abuse and there is still a transportation dependency problem. Remove the social vanity and there is still a wage problem. That is why the market feels less like a temporary imbalance and more like a structure whose contradictions are finally becoming visible. There is a line in all of this that matters to me more than the rest. The goal of sensible finance is not to impress strangers. The goal is to preserve freedom of action. A paid-off car that gets you where you need to go is often worth more than a polished statement to the neighborhood. A modest car with low carrying costs can do something a flashy financed car cannot do. It can leave you with choices. It can let you walk away from a bad job. It can let you survive a short interruption in income. It can let you build savings instead of sending every spare dollar into a driveway ornament. It can let you think with a cooler mind. Because the next bill is not always one surprise away from disaster. That is why I have never been moved by automotive theater. A machine that serves you is useful. A machine you serve is an expense disguised as pride. The distinction matters. If I were advising a young person today, I would say this: do not let a culture of display teach you to insult your own future. If the car is safe, reliable enough, and paid for, there is dignity in that. If you are forced into a loan because life gives you no workable alternative, do not confuse necessity with shame. If you can avoid rolling negative equity into the next purchase, avoid it. If you can extend the useful life of what you already own without jeopardizing safety, do it. If you can build even a little distance between your identity and your vehicle, protect that distance like an asset, because it is one. And if you are raising children, teach them early that character is not parked in the driveway. The country desperately needs that lesson again. It is remarkable how often large systems are held together by small lies repeated socially. The lie that debt is maturity, the lie that the monthly payment is normal, the lie that an old car is evidence of failure, the lie that a better trim package means a better life, the lie that everyone else is doing fine, the lie that a person trapped in a bad loan must have deserved it, the lie that the economy is strong because the parking lot is full of expensive metal. I do not believe any of those things. I believe prosperity should widen a person's margin for error, not eliminate it. I believe technology should reduce friction, not turn every convenience into another subscription. I believe manufacturing should create durable value, not endless extraction. I believe workers should be able to participate in the prosperity their labor supports. And I believe a country built around debt-financed status symbols will eventually discover that appearances do not make a balance sheet safe. The car market is not just telling us what people are buying, it is telling us what kind of economy we built. We built one where labor often lags too far behind the cost of decent living. We built one where transit weakness forces private spending. We built one where shareholder logic outruns social logic. We built one where dealers, lenders, insurers, software systems, and data brokers all find a way to take another bite out of the same household. We built one where a person can follow every respectable rule and still feel cornered by a machine that was supposed to provide mobility. That is not a car problem alone, that is a national design problem. I would not underestimate the consequences of that design. An overstretched car market can become one of the dominoes that reveals stress across employment, credit, energy, insurance, and consumer spending all at once. It can expose the K-shaped economy people prefer not to discuss. It can reveal how many households looked solvent, only because nothing had gone wrong yet. It can show how much of modern stability was actually just uninterrupted payment flow. And when that flow breaks, people will talk as if the collapse arrived suddenly. It will not be sudden. It will be the accumulated result of choices made over decades. A workday once shortened so workers could live. An investor culture later empowered to put return first. An industry taught to sell aspiration through debt. A country built around driving rather than accessible mobility. A public trained to measure worth through visible consumption. A financial system willing to stretch terms, roll losses forward, and securitize the strain. A technology layer now trying to charge rent on features and harvest value from behavior. An energy shock or tariff shock waiting to tighten the screws further. That is not one accident. That is a sequence. It has been running for a long time. I do not think despair is useful, but I do think clarity is useful. The first form of power ordinary people recover in a distorted system is moral clarity about what the system is actually doing. If you understand that much of this was engineered, you stop turning every burden into a private shame. If you understand that status pressure is part of the machinery, you become less obedient to it. If you understand that keeping an unfashionable but workable car can be an act of financial intelligence, you stop apologizing for it. If you understand that a paid-off vehicle may represent more real wealth than a financed luxury model, you begin to see the social theater for what it is. And if enough people relearn those things, the culture loses some of its grip even before the economics improve. I cannot promise that the car market will become fair on its own. I cannot promise that prices will suddenly behave, or that lenders will rediscover restraint, or that policymakers will rebuild mobility systems quickly enough to matter for households under pressure today. But I can say this. No durable financial life was ever built by confusing the symbol of prosperity with prosperity itself. A car can carry you, it should not define you. It can help you earn, it should not consume the very future you are trying to earn toward. It can be useful, it should not become a shrine. The older I get, the less impressed I am by expensive proof and the more impressed I am by quiet resilience. A person who can withstand a setback without immediately begging the future for relief is in a stronger position than a person who looks polished, but cannot absorb a bump in the road. That principle applies to families, to businesses, and to nations. America would be wise to remember it, because when a society needs people to finance dignity in order to participate in daily life, the real collapse has already started, long before the repossession truck arrives.